Donald seems to think he's Michael Corleone, that if any voter, if any delegate doesn't support Donald Trump, then he's just going to bully him and threaten him. I don't know if the next thing we're going to see is voters or delegates waking up with horses' heads in their bed. But that doesn't belong in the electoral process, and I think Donald needs to renounce this incitement of violence. He needs to stop asking his supporters at rally to punch protesters in the face, and he needs to fire the people responsible. He needs to denounce Manafort and Roger Stone and his campaign team that is encouraging violence, and he needs to stop doing it himself. When Donald Trump himself stands up and says, if I'm not the nominee, there will be rioting in the streets. Well, you know what? Saul Alinsky was laughing in his grave watching Donald Trump incite violence that has no business in our democracy.
I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world. And our opening clip was of Senator Ted Cruz denouncing Donald Trump's violence in an April 2016 interview. So we had a big week last week. We ended up doing two Patreon-only impeachment specials because on Saturday, Trump, a traitor who backed a violent attack on the Capitol for the sake of prolonging his own power illegally, was acquitted by his co-conspirators in the Senate. And, you can go and listen to our episodes on that. I'm just going to rehash a couple of points for folks who don't subscribe to our Patreon, but of course you should, because you can get this early. The first point is that the impeachment managers were able to prove that Trump incited a violent insurrection. They used video, social media, and other primary source accounts. But as we noted, and many others did as well, they should have also called witnesses. But in addition to that, one thing that they should have done is explain how Trump's inner circle of elite criminal backers served as a bridge between Trump and the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, QAnon, and other violent actors. The individuals here include Roger Stone, who coined the Stop the Steal phrase not in 2020, but all the way back in 2016, when he was working for the Trump campaign and threatening a bloodbath if Trump was not installed as president in 2016 under that election. This is an old story. This is an old narrative. This whole big lie thing that the media suddenly discovered did not emerge in 2020. It's been their guiding precept the entire time. There is also Michael Flynn, who was conveniently pardoned, not that long before the Capitol coup, and who went on to serve as the QAnon hype man, getting the conspiracy theorists riled up, using his military background to try to give the illegal insurrection some sort of facade of illegality. And of course, Flynn and his son, Michael Flynn Jr., were instrumental in developing the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which served as a kind of prelude to the QAnon conspiracy theories that were to come. Then there is Steve Bannon, another campaign manager for Trump. And I'll just quote him. This is a quote from Steve Bannon on January 5th, the day before the violent attack. He said, "All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. Just understand this. All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's going to be moving. It's going to be quick." So many people said, man, if I was in a revolution, I would be in Washington. Well, this is your time in history. It's all converging, and now we're on the point of attack tomorrow. And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day. So that was said on his podcast. That's the kind of a clip you might want to play in the Senate chambers to show very clearly that Trump's inner circle was guiding this attack. They were giving out directions, they were giving out instructions, and they weren't hiding it. And then finally, another person, who had all of this evidence towards incitement in the public domain was Lin Wood, Trump's lawyer in 2020, who used his Twitter account to recruit insurrectionists and gave them specific specific details on what to do. And so for all of these guys, they didn't need to call witnesses. They didn't need to call them as witnesses. They didn't need to call, people who witnessed their behavior as witnesses, because all of them put this out in the public domain. They felt so confident that they were going to get away with it. And there was reason for that. They had been pardoned, and some of them, like Roger Stone, had been participating in criminal operations on behalf of the GOP for his entire career, facing no repercussions. And so you have to ask why. Why were they not brought up during the Senate impeachment hearings? Why are they not facing repercussions or seemingly investigation now? The big problem is not these randos who joined QAnon after seeing a Twitter post that got them heated up. It's these elite power players who have surrounded Trump and who have been guiding our country down a path of destruction for a long time. And, one final name to add to this is Rudy Giuliani, who is serving as a sort of, as a similar role as Flynn and Stone, going out and talking to the Trump crowds, going on TV and, spreading the lie that the election had been stolen from Trump. It's another longtime Trump lawyer, another lackey, another individual deeply immersed in organized crime. And we saw the first sort of signs of life regarding any kind of consequences today, where Congressman Benny Thompson, who I believe is from Mississippi, filed a federal lawsuit today accusing Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, the Proud Boys, and Oath Keepers of conspiring to incite a violent riot on the Capitol on January 6th with the goal of preventing Congress from certifying the 2020 presidential election. His lawsuit alleges that by preventing Congress from carrying out its official duties, Trump, Giuliani, and the hate groups directly violated the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. So Andrea, given that you are such a Ulysses S. Grant fan and have studied the aftermath of the Civil War and similar hate groups that led to that law in 1871, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I think a lot of people should bring lawsuits against Trump and his family, like a class action lawsuit against mass trauma. Obviously, we need to use all the laws we have at our disposal, even if they go back to fighting white terrorism after the Civil War, because we're up against the neo-Confederates today and they want to dismantle our democracy. It's just plain as day, and they're just chipping away at us. I do think it's worth noting the one senator who is up for re-election in 2022, and that's Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and her statement on why she voted to impeach. This was, of course, the most bipartisan impeachment trial ever in terms of the large vote. It wasn't enough to convict, clearly, and remove Trump from running for office again. He's going to come back with a vengeance. He keeps telling us that. Richard Burr, the senator of North Carolina, who is not running again. He's had enough, apparently. Laura Trump is being endorsed to run for that seat by Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's most reliable lackeys in the Senate. Everyone wonders, what does Trump have on Graham? Well, Graham was caught up in Trump's hate speech, his violent rhetoric. During a Trump rally in 2016, Trump gave out Lindsey Graham's phone number to the rally. This was at a time when Trump rallies across the country were leading to a increase in hate crimes. That is research out of a team of researchers out of Texas that were looking at comparing counties in 2016 that hosted Trump rallies compared to similar counties that did not. They saw an over 200% increase in hate crimes in the counties that had Trump rallies in 2016. And Lindsey Graham was a target of Trump behind the podium. I think it's very important for people to understand all the hate speech that we've been polluted by over the last 5 years has consequences. And now that Trump is off the hook, thanks to Republicans in the Senate, we're going to continue with that fire hose of hate speech terror being targeted to create a culture of terror to subdue Trump's opponents, journalists, political opponents, and so forth. So Trump can keep his hands clean and his supporters can carry out the acts of violence for him. So that's why it's really important for us to hold up the rare occasions when Republicans do what's right by their country. And so now I'm going to read from Lisa Murkowski's statement. On January 13, when the U.S. House of Representatives impeached former President Donald J. Trump for a second time, I committed to upholding my oath as a U.S. Senator to listen to each side impartially, review all the facts, and then decide how I would vote. I have done that, and after listening to the trial this past week, I've reached the conclusion that President Trump's actions were an impeachable offense, and his course of conduct amounts to incitement of insurrection, as set out in the article of impeachment. The facts made clear that the violence and desecration of the Capitol that we saw on January 6 was not a spontaneous uprising. President Trump had set the stage months before the 2020 election by stating repeatedly that the election was rigged, casting doubt into the minds of the American people about the fairness of the election. After the election, when he lost by 7 million votes, he repeatedly claimed that the election was stolen and subjected to widespread fraud. At the same time, election challenges were filed in dozens of courts, 61 different courts, including many judges nominated by President Trump himself, ruled against him. President Trump did everything in his power to stay in power. When the court challenges failed, he turned up the pressure on state officials and his own Department of Justice. And when these efforts failed, he turned to his supporters. He urged his supporters to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6 to stop the steal of an election that had not been stolen. The speech he gave on that day was intended to stoke passions in a crowd that the president had been rallying for months. They were prepared to march on the Capitol, and he gave them explicit instructions to do so. When President Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol, breached both chambers of Congress, and interrupted the certification of Electoral College votes, he took no action for hours. The evidence presented at the trial was clear. President Trump was watching events unfold live, just as the entire country was, even after the violence had started, as protesters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," inside the Capitol. President Trump, aware of what was happening, tweeted that the vice president had failed the country. Vice President Pence was attempting to fulfill his oath and his constitutional duty with the certification of Electoral College votes. After the storm had calmed, the president endorsed the actions of the mob by tweeting, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." This message, in defense of only himself, came nearly 4 hours after the attack on the Capitol began. President Trump allowing the violence to go on for hours without any clear directive or demand for peace, his intentional silence, cost Americans their lives. President Trump was not concerned about the vice president. He was not concerned about members of Congress. He was not concerned about the Capitol Police. He was concerned about his election and retaining power. While I supported subpoenaing witnesses to help elucidate for the American people President Trump's state of mind during the riot, both his actions and lack thereof established that. If months of lies, organizing a rally of supporters in an effort to thwart the work of Congress, encouraging a crowd to march on the Capitol, and then taking no meaningful action to stop the violence once it began is not worthy of impeachment, conviction, and disqualification from holding office in the United States, I cannot imagine what is. By inciting the insurrection and violent events that culminated on January 6th, President Trump's actions and words were not protected free speech. I honor our constitutional rights and consider the freedom of speech as one of the most paramount freedoms, but that right does not extend to the President of the United States inciting violence. Before someone assumes the office of the presidency, they are required to swear to faithfully execute the office of the president and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. President Trump, the nation's elected leader, the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, swore an oath to defend America and all that we hold sacred. He failed to uphold that oath. One positive outcome of the horrible events on January 6th was that hours after the Capitol was secured on January 7 at 4 a.m., Congress fulfilled our responsibility to the U.S. Constitution and certified the Electoral College results. We were able to do that because of brave men and women who fulfilled their oath to protect and defend Congress. I regret that Donald Trump was not one of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where this shouldn't be hard for Republicans, and statements like that shouldn't be rare because, as we saw throughout the impeachment hearings themselves, the violent rioters in the Capitol were directly threatening to murder them. Like they were running after Mitt Romney. They were threatening to hang Mike Pence. And, whatever you think of the Republicans, or for that matter, of the Democrats, clearly running around threatening to assassinate people is, not something that should ever be accepted in our Capitol. And it's amazing to me the way that the majority of these Republicans just kind of shrugged and looked the other way when they are targets. They are pawns. They think they're players, but they're just pawns. And one of the few kind of signs of life I've seen, besides Murkowski and I guess Romney and a few others in the Senate, is in Georgia, where Georgia Secretary of State, was on tape with Trump threatening him, telling him to change the election results so that he would win. And then his whole family was threatened because he refused to comply with Trump, a mafia president, and his orders. And what's interesting to me is that while we're watching in Manhattan, lackey Cy Vance, who has decades of experience of letting the wealthy, corrupt elites just off the hook, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or Ivanka and Don Jr., in Georgia, they may be cracking down. A Georgia prosecutor is investigating that phone call, as well as a call between Lindsey Graham and Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State. And that's part of a broader criminal probe, seeing whether Trump violated Georgia law. And so I have a little bit, it's such a strange world in 2021 where we have a blue Georgia, first off, two Democratic senators and, Georgia voting for Biden, but also a Republican Party in Georgia that, for its many flaws, seems far more willing to stand up for Trump. And I think it's because they're removed from the mafia culture of New York City that has always served as a buffer for Trump, for Giuliani, for Michael Cohen, for so many people in his criminal cabal. Georgia is also corrupt. Georgia is corrupt in a different way. Georgia is corrupt in a neo-Confederate way. And within that is a certain kind of pride. They don't appreciate being treated as pawns of the Trump machine, a machine that will take away their vote, a machine that will threaten them if they don't instantly obey. And so I think that is something to watch. Like, I don't have great faith in a good outcome because there's basically never been an outcome where Trump actually had to face accountability for his crimes and where all of the other individuals I named had to face any kind of meaningful consequences. And even when they did, like with Manafort going to prison, for example, they were released not long after. And so all of these, Mueller's going to save us, Vance is going to save us, assholes, they're just consistently wrong on this because they're underestimating how deep the rot goes. But the rot in Georgia is of a specific and disparate nature. And while I don't like rot and corruption in any way, it'll be interesting to see, how that plays out.
Speaking of rot, I think we should acknowledge the millions of people in Texas right now who are freezing in
oh God, including my sister, yes.
In extreme storms made worse by climate change, with which Republicans refuse to deal with because they're busy making money off of all their corporations and their corporate backers that pollute the planet at the expense of all of us. So John Tedesco, an investigative reporter for the Houston Chronicle, tweeted out a story. The ERCOT grid has collapsed in exactly the same manner as the old Soviet Union. It limped along on underinvestment and neglect until it finally broke under predictable circumstances. That's how the state's power grid failed millions of Texans. And Anise Parker, the former Houston mayor, shared that story with her own edition, writing, 25 years of total Republican control of the state of Texas. That's what it got voters, a Soviet Union-like failure at a time when they need basic services the most. And you might be wondering, why would voters go against their own interests election cycle after election cycle? Because the power of losing your inhibitions is extremely strong and intoxicating. These are voters who vote for corruption, who vote for officials to cut taxes for the rich that will then be, with all the costs associated with that, being shouldered by the poor and the shrinking middle class, and vote against a reduction in basic services like maintaining roads and a power grid because they want to be able to live free of accountability. They don't want to have to do all of that heavy work of being empathetic towards the needs of a changing society. They don't want to have to be, quote unquote, politically correct towards women wanting equal rights and an equal representation in the world, towards people of color, towards transgender people. They want to be able to have the freedom of essentially being bigoted and openly racist and having this quote unquote freedom. And when they talk about freedom on the Republican side, what they really mean is freedom from accountability, freedom from empathy, freedom from having to deal with sharing this world with anybody else. That's why you always have these Republicans coming to power with some belligerent foreign policy, which is a reflection of their belligerent domestic policy. So this is what Republicans get us, a Soviet failed state in the making. And so it's very fitting that they had a Kremlin asset as president that led to the mass murder of nearly 500,000 Americans from a totally avoidable pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fitting that one of the senators who was backing this insurrection and remains utterly unapologetic is Ted Cruz. And, that's the thing that Trump's supporters and Republicans in general need to learn. The pandemic should have proven it to you, is they will let you die. They want you to die because you're in the way, unless you are one of their donors, unless you are in this incredibly, rare 1% stratified segment of the elite. And within that, you have, no capacity for independent thought and are happy to obey their orders. They want to get rid of you. You're a useless eater, as the fascists, of yore would say. And so
they think you're gross.
Yeah, they think you're gross. They think you're useless. They know climate change is real. They have known that the whole time. This whole thing where they pretend to not believe in climate change and not believe in science, what they want, as Andrea just said, they don't want to be accountable to that. They don't want to make actual policy decisions about that. They don't want to do things for the benefit of ordinary people and not for the benefit of fossil fuel companies or large corporations that make up their donor base. And then, of course, on top of that, you have just plain old sadism, as demonstrated with Trump, who is very content to let a pandemic ravage this country. And you also have this apocalyptic evangelical view of a futureless world, of people like Mike Pompeo, who govern according to the rapture. And so when a climate change disaster occurs, they don't see it as a crisis. They see it as an opportunity. And they see it sometimes, if they're, deeply pious, or at least pretending to be for political clout, they see it as a sign, and they present it as a sign, that it's God's will, and it's God's will to apparently have the Republicans let Texans, who don't have the proper, pipes or homes, to prepare for this kind of winter storm, just die off. Like I'm very worried about what's going to happen in Texas, especially, but also some of the surrounding states over the next few days. It's a personal worry for me. Like my sister lives there. She lives in Dallas, and, she hasn't had power since 6:00 last night, and she's in her house with 2 children, and, they can't drive on the roads, and they took every precaution they could, but homes simply aren't built that way. And there are people much worse off than her. There are homeless people. There are, very poor people. There are people who, there's going to be death from this event. And it's a horrible, tragic sign. And it's just a sign of how urgently we need federal intervention, but we also need to figure out something about states like Texas, which of course has its own grid, and they took great pride in having its own grid. And they have made, some moves towards green energy and so forth, but, Texas is a oil-powered state. That's where their politicians get their Profits. So they're very reluctant to kind of embrace a, sensible climate change policy. But we're going to be having more and more of this in the years to come. Like, even as I record this show from St. Louis, it's like a wind chill out there of like -15. And I'm just hoping that I'm not in the rolling blackout while we're recording. So a couple other thoughts I didn't get to in the Patreon episode. Where's the FBI? Like, this is something I've been wondering now for over a month. Why does it seem that the FBI is not investigating people like Flynn and Stone and Bannon and Lynn Wood, even though they blatantly helped organize and participate in these attacks, putting their words and their endorsement in the public domain? Where is Christopher Wray? Why has he not held press conferences on the attacks? Why are we not getting regular updates from our government on an investigation of our own Capitol? If you were old enough for 9/11, you may remember, like, not a day went by for like a year where we didn't hear of some development in the investigation of the 9/11 attacks. Like, it was just constant. Here we actually had a breach of our Capitol with 5 people dead and people threatening to assassinate our representatives, and they are quiet. If I were Biden, I would fire Wray. So I wonder, why is Biden keeping him on? And what exactly is the FBI doing? Like, we have a very troubling history of the FBI for like the last basically 30 years where, we had James Comey, who, as we've reminded you many times, took the head of the Russian mafia off the FBI's top 10 most wanted list right when Donald Trump was gearing up his election, and people like Michael Flynn were meeting with Putin in Russia in December 2015. That's when he removed Semyon Mogilevich. He then, of course, ignored calls from people like Harry Reid to investigate Trump's connections with Russia and make those connections, publicly known to the United States before the election. Instead, he just concentrated on Hillary's emails. We also had previous FBI directors, William Sessions and Louis Freeh, who went on to work for the Russian mafia as consultants after being in the FBI, which is a very strange thing to do. As an FBI director, you have plenty of career options. Like, why would you choose to work for the people who you were just warning were the most dangerous and violent in the world and who were set?
Money.
But even with money, you can make so much money being slightly less corrupt. Like, you could just go work for, some other gross organization. Like, why does it have to be the Russian mafia? And then, of course, there's Mueller, who was the head of the FBI while Epstein was running around, Manafort was running around. Mueller basically helped suppress information that was in the 9/11 investigation about the role of Saudi Arabia and probably other countries and their involvement in those attacks. Like, he's a cover-up guy. So we have this continuum. And Wray, to me at least, seems like he is part of that continuum of covering up deep-seated institutional rot, infiltration of our institutions by organized crime, and complicity by primarily the Republican Party, but to some extent the Democratic Party as well, particularly just in terms of negligence, of refusing to stop these threats about which they are warned, many, many times. This applies to basically every Democratic administration, of my lifetime. And so there's another thing too with the FBI, where we've seen them tweeting out, like, have you seen this guy? And it's like some, low-level QAnon acolyte wearing a MAGA cap, like looking all crazy. Who they have not called, to pursue are the high-level stormtroopers, the people who folks like Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and so forth have been interacting with and cultivating as operatives for years and years. People like Ali Alexander, who just called for a civil war yet again, despite his, open participation in this violent insurrection. People like Alex Jones, who has been beating, this violent conspiracy theory drum for 20 years, working with Trump, working with the administration. And then other people who are, known as the quote unquote alt-right. They do not seem interested in holding these people accountable. They're not even talking about them, just like they're not talking about Stone, Manafort, Flynn, etc. It's like they're afraid or complicit, one or the other. What it comes down to is the FBI is acting as if they are protecting all of these individuals and protecting the wider transnational network that is behind them, which extends into Russia, into the UK, into Israel, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. This was not an all-American insurrection. Obviously many people just joined it because they really, really liked Donald Trump and they thought he would protect them if they went and stormed the Capitol for him. But we also had really sophisticated operatives, people like Roger Stone who have been in this game for 40 years, since Nixon, trying to take down America and are willing to work with anyone from any country to do it. And it's very disturbing to me that the FBI just seems to be making no effort in this respect.
Someone should take the footage of the sea of white people storming our nation's capital and CGI it or whatever to turn all those white people to black and brown people, and then send it to the FBI and see if they do anything about it finally.
Maybe, although Ali Alexander is black, I believe. I mean, he's certainly not white, and they're just like looking the other way. I mean, I think it's the embrace of white supremacy. It doesn't matter what your actual skin color is or what your ethnicity is, as long as you are willing to back white supremacy as a concept, as a precept for how the United States should be governed, then they're cool with you. That goes all the way back to the days of, J. Edgar Hoover. Like, we've got some deep problems in the FBI, but go on.
Without question. But obviously, if this was a Black Lives Matter siege on the Capitol, which would never happen, but if it was, we would have a much different national response, a united federal response of press conferences, and Chris Wray would be likely speaking. This feeling of, if this was such a big deal, surely someone would be doing something about it. And that was the same crisis of normalization we're up against with the rise of Donald Trump in 2015, 2016, a guy who was dependent on dirty Russian oligarch money, whose Trump Tower was a Russian mafia dorm, whose campaign chairman worked for a decade for the Kremlin in Ukraine and against U.S. interests. Surely, if Donald Trump was so mobbed up and in the pocket of Kremlin interests, somebody would have done something about it. And we're up against that now. We had a rushed impeachment trial. We have an absent FBI director who should be very visible and holding weekly press conferences. It's fine that the FBI is tweeting out images of these insurrectionists and saying, do you know this person? And then suddenly a bunch of ex-girlfriends and ex-wives turn that guy in. That's great and that's helpful. But what we need is an extremely visible response to this, because if you don't, then you're going to normalize this. And then the next coup is just going to slide right in. And people are going to be like, oh, okay, so Ivanka Trump's president now for life. And our kids are going to be born and die under a Ivanka Trump regime. That's what happens, is failed coups come first, and then they learn and they spruce up their tactics and they wear down their opposition and they steamroll over any accountability and they normalize those tactics. And next thing you know, they're in power, once they're in power, they're extremely difficult to get out of power. You see examples of this everywhere. It's the decline of democracy is a worldwide problem. You have Myanmar right now being overtaken by a military coup by the same military generals that oversaw the genocide of the Muslim minority. You have Bolsonaro, who is propped up by hardline evangelicals, who has been inciting massive political violence through his rhetoric. He gets to enjoy plausible deniability and say things like Trump does, with fake news and accusing his opponents for being the ones that are inciting political violence, just like Trump and his allies do. But meanwhile, you have murders in the streets of LGBT people in Brazil and violent attacks on female journalists, violent attacks on trans women. You have the only openly gay member of Congress in Brazil having to flee the country because of this hate rhetoric. Hate speech is not protected speech. Hate speech is a weapon in the playbook used by dictators, used by strongmen like Bolsonaro, like Trump. Hate speech is an extremely reliable weapon. When Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was killed in the shadow of the Kremlin. In the initial hours, one of the comments observers were making was, yes, it could have been the Kremlin. Yes, it could have been the FSB, but it also could have been this culture of hatred drummed up by Putin's propaganda machine, this culture of terror, of disinformation, of propaganda that drove somebody to do it. Understand that hate speech is not protected speech. It is a weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's why it's critical that we never normalize that kind of speech and rhetoric, which of course our media did steadily, over decades, but particularly under Trump's rule, and don't normalize the coup. Like, I shouldn't have to say, don't normalize a fucking coup, like an attempted violent coup that lets death on our capital. But I look at the last 4 years, and among the things that we've normalized, or other people have normalized, are the president of the United States being a Kremlin asset, the president of the United States being named as individual one in a federal probe, mass death from a pandemic that the administration let spread and then outright said, let's infect them. We've normalized that. People have normalized the statistics of death that come in from the COVID pandemic every day. And now we're on the oh, yeah, it looks like it's going to be another coup. Like a coup's coming around the bend on March 4th. That's the kind of conversation that people have nowadays. And it's because of the lack of urgency and the lack of action. And it's crazy because we see people express urgency when they talk about, quote unquote, cancel culture, or when they get all freaked out about, AOC or Bernie or Warren or other progressives. Then we see the Republicans get in action. Then we saw last year at this time during the primaries, the Democrats assembling into centrist Voltron and all dropping out at once so that Biden can take the lead. They know how to organize against things. They know how to inform the public about things. They know how to bring consequences for people, but the people facing consequences are either the most vulnerable or those fighting on their behalf. They're not these criminal elites who are the actual source of pain and suffering for this nation. And further normalization is just going to make the matter worse. Speaking of normalization, should we discuss the Lincoln Project and its members?
Yeah, what a tragedy.
I don't know if it's a tragedy. It's just
Well, it's a tragedy because all of the millions that the Lincoln Project raked in, including for John Weaver, who was out there trying to molest young men and lure them in with promises of fancy jobs, all those millions could have gone to credible organizations like Run for Something, like Every District, and done all...
Or Stacey Abrams' group.
Yeah, and fueled all the important, essential grassroots work that's needed when we're up against a right-wing takeover, hijacking of our democracy. So that's the real tragedy there.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that there are warning signs about John Weaver. He took some job at one point, in the recent years under Trump, linked to Russian oligarchs, and he had to get named and shamed to reject that job, as far as we know. So they're sort of what are your values? You know what you're up against. You're out there openly fighting for it, and then you go and take some blood money assignment. So clearly that guy was sus, as the kids say, the kids who play games that I'm not really fully aware of, but
the kids who John Weaver solicits online.
Yes. And so I'm glad that the Lincoln Project is dismantled. There was also George Conway, who was associated with it. George Conway, who was married to the Goebbels of the Trump regime, Kellyanne Conway, who gave us the atrocity of coining alternative facts. Kellyanne Conway was an effective pit bull for Trump. She was hawking Ivanka's wares on TV. And George Conway being associated with it was also a red flag.
No kidding. Sorry.
Yeah, and we were always outspoken about George Conway. And when people would ask us about him in our Patreon Q&A, we'd be like, "Let us tell you about George Conway." And so it's not surprising to learn either that they have a teenage daughter who's struggling right now, and then they put her on. She goes from having, documenting a personal crisis for the world to see on TikTok to being on the stage for American Idol. It's how dystopian can you be? This felt like a Black Mirror episode. And so it's just, this is clearly a troubled family. Parenting is the hardest job in the world, but just the choices this family is making out in the open is very much contributing to this really large unease that they give off, these creepy vibes by George Conway and his wife, Kellyanne. It's like, I wish they would go away, but they're going to remain useful for Trump and his family. Kellyanne Conway will continue to rake in blood money as the pit bull for Trumpism, and George Conway will continue to look the other way to try to gain a foothold in respectable mainstream culture. And that's how these guys are playing us.
Yeah, it's controlled opposition. Like, I don't know how people couldn't see this. You know, we were very blunt about George Conway and also about just do not give the Lincoln Project your money. That was the takeaway of every Gaslit Nation episode where we were named, like, please, God, do not give them your money, because this is a people, you know, who, you know, have a long history of terrible decisions, of things like trying to launch the Iraq War, launch Sarah Palin's career. And yes, it is possible that Republicans, when greeted with Donald Trump, could change their mind and could try to work for the greater good. And when they said they're going to go put out ads, you know, to try to convert Republicans, you know, to vote for Joe Biden, and it's like, okay, whatever. But over time, it became very clear that that's not where the money was going. You know, the Lincoln Project is falling apart for a number of reasons. You know, the main reason is that founding member John Weaver, as Andrea just said, is a sexual predator. Among his victims is a 14-year-old boy who he was trying to solicit online. The other members of the Lincoln Project knew about this, even though it was, you know, this information was brought to the public, you know, recently. They knew since allegedly March of 2020. You know, it's a very long time to cover something like that up. Weaver stayed in the group until the summer. The bulk of the money that they made went not to those ad campaigns, which incidentally, there's no proof those ad campaigns convinced anyone of anything. They were basically preaching to the converted. They were getting, you know, some Democrats and liberals all excited because for once it seemed like, you know, there might be some fight in them. Like, if there's any takeaway here, it's that Democrats like it when people fight vehemently against Trump and fight on their behalf, which of course Pelosi and Schumer and others refuse to do. And so they go and they embrace the Lincoln Project, a scam pack who was taking the money to enhance their personal wealth. For example, departed member Steve Schmidt said that his goal was to create, quote, intergenerational wealth for himself and for his family. And these guys raked in millions of dollars, often from donations from Democrats who, again, could have been donating to a variety of other groups that actually need the money and actually, you know, do practical grassroots organizing to help, you know, vulnerable communities and help good candidates. And they brought themselves mansions. And then the last thing they did is they posted private DMs between a reporter who was investigating the two things that I just mentioned and a departed female Lincoln Project member who had complained about misogyny and complained about mistreatment. And they posted them all online until George Conway kind of, you know, broke in and said, hey guys, like, I think this is a federal offense for you to do that. And then they deleted them. But the damage was done and the mask was off. The hostility was out there. You know, there are a variety of people in the Lincoln Project or supporting it. I think some are worse than others. I think one of the worst is George Conway, and anyone who fell for this little James Carville, Mary, whatever her name is from the 1990s, you know, rehash of like, oh, we're a Democrat and a Republican, but we get along and we're a couple. Like, it's a reality TV show plot. Kellyanne Conway, obviously, you know, as Andrea said, is Trump's Goebbels. George Conway, a Federalist Society member, was never on the right side here and was never trustworthy. And Trump would have gotten rid of Kellyanne Conway long ago if George Conway were not actually on Trump's side. And the fact that people can't see this, it's like Trump does this all the time. He let Michael Wolff, you know, who has long served as a kind of tabloid PR guy for various nefarious actors from New York City, like Jeffrey Epstein, for example, he let him hang out in the White House for a couple of years to write a book that used the prime Trump tactic, which is cover up crime with scandal. They want you to think he's stupid, incompetent, obnoxious, disgusting, whatever, as long as you don't think that he's a criminal and as long as you don't bring forth criminal consequences. The Conway family understands this tactic extraordinarily well, and they're using it to their benefit through social media and now on TV. And so that brings me to Claudia Conway, who, whatever you think about this, is a victim of this situation. You know, the Claudia Conway situation is like a vortex where the Trump kleptocracy meets the Britney Spears documentary, and you realize that people didn't learn anything from any of them. Claudia, of course, became well known because she would post TikTok videos claiming that her parents, both of them, were abusing her and calling for emancipation. And in some videos, she showed the abuse. She taped Kellyanne Conway abusing her. That's one of the reasons, that Kellyanne Conway left the White House and George Conway left the Lincoln Project, in the fall of last year. But no one ever intervened into this family. No one ever looked at the abuse. Instead, they put her on TV, which is making people wonder, was this all staged? Was Claudia Conway herself acting, out this family drama on TikTok as a prelude to maximize profits on TV? And so I'll just say either way, she is a victim of abuse. If she's being abused by Kellyanne and George Conway, which I find likely, then she's an abused child. If she's being told to act out parental abuse and then go on a national stage to profit off of it, then she's abused again. That's just another form of exploitation. And it's so depressing that we have all these conversations about the exploitation of teenage girls. We saw it with Britney Spears. There's been a conversation about the treatment of Princess Diana. We go through this over and over again. And of course, there's been a lot of talk because of Me Too about teenage victims, and about people like Evan Rachel Wood recently came out, about Marilyn Manson and his abuse of her when she was a teenager. Teenage girls are in a vulnerable position no matter what when they're dealing with predatory adults, when they're surrounded by them, even if those adults are claiming that they're acting on their behalf. They're not. And so this whole situation is so depressing and so disgusting. And I just hope people don't fall for it. Like, please stop falling for the same tricks over and over. Please stop falling for scandal covering crime, for reality TV normalizing a criminal family. That is how Donald Trump got into office, by the way. He got into office because of The Apprentice, because a lot of people fell for that image of him as a tycoon. He was using his apprentice properties to launder money, which I documented in my book, Hiding in Plain Sight. And he was also backed by Mark Burnett, whose first choice for a reality TV show was Putin. Like, this is an actual serious thing, this reality TV infotainment complex. It structures American political culture probably more than anything else. Like reality TV, cable news, tabloid news, like it all intersects. So you can't look at something like Claudia Conway going on American Idol and just sort of dismiss it as a trivial story or like none of our business or whatever. It's a dark omen because they're all going to try to rehabilitate their careers this way. And then you also have the form of rehabilitation that was attempted by members of the Lincoln Project, who then went on to say, I'm not going to show you my finances. I'm not going to tell you what we're actually up to. You cannot trust these folks. You cannot trust dirty Republicans who have a really horrible documented history. Like, they're very likely not turning the page and seeing the light and embracing a moral position. Like, I really wish they were. But I think when someone does that, when someone is seeking redemption or they're seeking to turn their life around, they act differently. They would be going out and backing people like Stacey Abrams. They would be backing these movements for civil rights and not just like making cool ads or getting media attention or being pundits on cable. Like, they'd be doing something much more meaningful, and they'd be putting their money where their mouth is. And they just don't. They don't do that. It's just for them. And I know that's very disappointing for a lot of people. But you gotta like open your eyes to these schemes and get out of this delusion of a like noble Republican Party. I know Nancy Pelosi is out there calling for a quote, strong GOP. You know, that was her takeaway from the Senate impeachment hearings. It's not, we have a Kremlin asset backed by transnational crime, ordering violent insurrection on the Capitol and getting away with it. But we need a strong GOP, even though the GOP itself backed Trump, supports Trump. Like, we don't. We need something different. Like, we need an overhauled GOP. We need a GOP that's like gutted from within and maybe turned into like, I don't know, like a low-key Alex P. Keaton party. Like, I don't even know what its future is. Like, it doesn't have a future because it's a fascist apocalyptic cult and it has no place in American politics. So I don't know why that's her position. Anyway, do you have thoughts on that?
Friends don't let friends vote Republican. It's the Republican Party gave us Donald Trump. It's extremely rare when a president loses the popular vote but wins the Electoral College. That has happened twice in our lifetimes, both times Republican. So it's been this whole fallout from the Reagan Revolution that we've been suffering under, this whole lie, the gaslighting of trickle-down economics, which has just exploded the income inequality gap. So all of these Republicans that became never Trumpers, you were part of the problem. Like, Trump was your Frankenstein monster, and now you want to cash in on trying to curb your own creation. Well, it's too late. He's unleashed. And once you create a dictator, once you empower him, once the culture has brainwashed tens of millions of people into voting for him, it's extremely hard to overcome that. We're now living with this. And I think in terms of the reality television, it's the dumbing down of America. The rise of strongmen are preceded by a dumbing down of mainstream media, of television culture. You saw that with Berlusconi in Italy. He through his cronyism, got all these regulations pulled back, and he was able to buy up a bunch of TV networks, and he dumbed them down. He turned them into misogynistic weapons against women, showing just scantily clad women and just salacious reports. And so it's no surprise when Berlusconi runs for president and pretty easily wins, because he set the stage for that through his trash TV culture. It's not surprising that you have the rise of far-right the far-right authoritarian threat, a white supremacist terrorist movement that was preceded by Rupert Murdoch having his way with our media landscape. Rupert Murdoch, the son of a eugenicist. And so it's a dangerous time. And that's why we're always screaming at the Democrats to do more, to use their power in Congress to hold all these compelling hearings, to extend the impeachment trial, because they need to break through the wall of normalization. They need to break through the cage bars of far-right propaganda in America. And by using your authority, which already commands an audience, which already comes with built-in press interest, which is rare, right? You have such a privileged perch on which to protect us and help us. And if you're not using that to the fullest by creating must-watch, compelling TV, by airing out this whole cast of characters from Steve Bannon to Flynn to Michael Flynn's brother, the Pentagon that deliberately slowed down the much-needed urgent response by the National Guard as our capital is under siege, by not wheeling out all this whole colorful cast of characters and bringing them out there, not necessarily forcing them to testify, but giving each of these guys their own investigation in Congress, you would turn C-SPAN into the new Fox News. People would be watching this and devouring the scandal. And that's one of the things we don't understand, is that we question all the time, is you're in this reality TV climate, the best reality TV right now is to come after Trump and investigate him. People will eat that up. And the fact that Democrats are being timid and containing their power there is extremely infuriating. And the prospects for that, for the upcoming election in 2022, it makes me worried. It makes me worried that they're missing such a major opportunity, and Republicans are just going to clobber them in 2022 because the independent voters they need in these swing districts don't understand the urgency. Because if there was an urgency, surely somebody would be doing something about it. Surely Christopher Wray would be testifying before Congress. Surely all of these characters or adjacent characters to Bannon and Flynn and others would be forced to testify before Congress. Surely they would be gripping testimony for the next 2 years. And instead, we're getting it swept under the rug. We're getting it rammed through. Nancy Pelosi wants to dust her hands of this. And we cannot emphasize to you how dangerous this is. You are allowing your opponent to relax, stretch out their arms, their fingers, and enjoy making their next move. You have put the ball so firmly into the hands of Trumpism, and they're going to have so much fun now coming after you. And it's horrible to live in this culture right now in the US. It's horrible to think I have to protect my family. Not just from, everyday life, but also the threat of authoritarianism coming. Like we're living our life through this pendulum swing of election cycles now. And normally it's okay, it's the Republicans now take the Congress in the midterm because we have a Democratic president, but it's no longer the Republican Party as we knew it as kids growing up. It is an authoritarian threat. And the next time they want to stay in power, they don't want to have to lose again. They were humiliated and they felt victimized. They were humiliated in front of all the world when they lost the 2020 election. So they're going to come and prove something to us next time. Ivanka Trump has a chip on her shoulder now from the 2020 election. She's going to come and prove something to us next time, and they're not going to give up power so easily next time. And I'm really fearful of the Democrats' response in giving them the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wrap up here, the lack of urgency and also just the rushing through of that trial, the refusal to have witnesses after saying that they were going to, that made it much worse than when they said that there weren't going to be. And people just thought that because people had this flickering moment of hope. All of that combined with just the grim circumstances under which we're living, the pandemic, climate change disasters like we're seeing in Texas, it adds up to a lot. It takes a toll on your mind. It takes a toll on your heart. And what I want people to do, this is why we call the show Gaslit Nation, is don't doubt yourself here. Like, don't doubt your perception. Don't doubt your frustration. Don't doubt your fear of the situation. Like, it is normal to feel afraid about what is happening right now. And when you see people blowing off a violent insurrectionist coup led by the president on the Capitol, like, it is a big deal that happened. It's also a big deal that they're blowing it off. And you should be outraged. You should never let it go. Just like you should never let go the 2016 election and Trump's long-term collaboration with transnational organized crime and the Kremlin. You should never let go the way the media protected him throughout all of this, the way our institutions failed us throughout all of this. Like, there's no room for forgiveness and moving on here until there is actual accountability. That is when people can forgive. And it is so necessary. It's necessary from just a, consequences for criminals standpoint, for our national security, for our national safety, but it's also, integral to our national cohesion, to our literal ability to exist as the United States of America. We need true accountability. And that's not just a commission that issues a report. That's serious consequences for the most powerful people who participated in this event. And coincidentally, they are often the same people that participated in the worst events of Trump's campaign and presidency, which were investigated for their illegality. These are people who already have been indicted, people like Bannon, Stone, Manafort, Flynn. It is a long list. And then they were pardoned because Trump predictably abused the pardon power. This needs to be rectified or they're going to keep coming back. Like, you are living in the political version of a slasher movie. The villain is not actually defeated. Like, he's out there lurking in the background. And just like in a slasher series, the sequels get worse and worse and worse each time until they are utterly unwatchable. So please keep pushing your representatives for accountability. Do not doubt yourself. Do not doubt your feelings. Do not doubt your eyes and ears. That is what they want from you, is to just shrug your shoulders, surrender, and move on. And that is unacceptable.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand due to the coronavirus crisis.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. And you can also subscribe to us on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level and higher on Patreon: John Schoenthaler,
Sarah Gray,
Frank Jaquette,
Kenneth Reed,
Ellen McGirt,
Jill Farron,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Melessia Howland,
Karen Heisler,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
Chris Bravo,
Stephanie Brandt MD,
Rachel Winder,
T.R. Dunstan,
Kim John Millet,
Michael Finn,
Chris Ash,
David East,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Dodie Pop,
Kristen Bredimus,
Gabrielle R.,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Amy Timon,
Michelle Swearingen,
Rich Holcomb,
Sean McDonald,
Jeremy Thompson,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Mulsum,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Ripon Rowe,
Matthew Womack,
Brittany Keener,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Keith Gottschalk,
William Barry Reeves,
Janet Robinson,
John Atrisk,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Sandra Collins,
Ren,
Kat Cooper,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Charles Othier,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Evan Rosemore,
Chip Salzenberg,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Golstad,
Michael Wooldridge,
Greg Kramer,
Jason Benke,
Marcus J. Trent,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Victoria Nordgren,
Solomon Hikes,
Trygve,
Christine M.,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Kelly Ranson,
Brian Tjuden,
Gustav Halsby,
Christy Vitale,
Adam Levine,
Maureen Murphy,
Michelle Dash,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Zachary Lemon,
Dorothy Kamerick,
Victoria Olson,
Alabama,
Jason Rita,
Henrik Bramius,
ZW,
Brian Collins,
Lisa LaFlame,
Jason Bainbridge,
Lawrence Graham,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
Jennifer Slavic,
Rhonda White,
Piet Yitzma,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Kim Mellon,
Leah Campbell,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys,
Giles Bauket,
Ann Marshall,
Irina Guardia,
Eric Kaplan,
Sonia Bogdanovich,
Pam Paris.
Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all for your support. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.